For a very long time, long before Insomniac started knocking it out of the park with their Spider-Man video games, the character already had an extensive catalog of playable adventures. When you'd ask people which of those was their favorite, you'd occasionally hear different responses based upon who you were asking. Some would swear by Web of Shadows, others would tell you Shattered Dimensions was the best, some would excitedly bring up Ultimate Spider-Man, but the game that usually seemed to dominate the top of lists of favorite Spider-Man games, the game that many people viewed as the definitive Spider-Man experience, was Spider-Man 2, the 2004 movie tie-in game. To this very day, it's the game that tops many people's list of favorite Spider-Man game, and it's always brought up as a talking point when people discuss what makes a great Spider-Man game, or what the top Spider-Man or best Spider-Man games are. Spider-Man 2 is a game that is still revered as a classic. Today, as someone who played this game extensively as a kid, I want to go back. I want to peel back the curtain of nostalgia and look at this game with an objective and analytical view. I want to really dissect what made this game work and why people still love it so much. Is it a game that truly told a timeless story that helped us empathize with Peter Parker and Spider-Man? Or is it a game that really hasn't aged all that well but is so shrouded in nostalgia that people will never accept that it's not a masterpiece? My goal today is to answer that very question as I carefully dissect this game's story and closely look at each plot point and the characterization of Peter Parker, by extension Spider-Man, and his allies and enemies, and how this game tied it all together into a cohesive experience. I want to closely look at the gameplay, the combat, the traversal, the open world activities. I want to look at this game as a complete package and truly determine how it holds up and how good of a job it does at portraying this character and this lore. But before I get too invested in talking about Spider-Man 2, I want to talk about where Spider-Man games were in this era before Spider-Man 2 released, and the state of those games. I think a good one that we can look at is the first movie tie-in game from 2002 for that first Sam Raimi film. I did consider making a standalone video essay for that first game, but as I started looking at it and going back and replaying some of the missions, I realized that there just isn't enough substance to truly make a full video essay about. The game's story is very bare bones. It takes the action set pieces from that first film with the Green Goblin, but instead of adding any real character development, it just adds a bunch of other villains for you to take on, which is appreciated. It keeps the game's pace very fast. It's really fun to see characters that weren't in the film given the Raimi aesthetic, and it's fun to play as the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man going up against villains who he never got to face in the films. Fortunately, this trend of including villains that weren't in the films in these games was one that continued throughout all the movie tie-in games, including the Amazing Spider-Man games, and I feel that this was a really clever, creative decision that allowed these game development teams to leave their mark on these stories, to expand these stories to their liking, to make these worlds feel more filled out and the lore feel more expansive. It was a great way to retool the pacing of these stories to fit the needs of a video game better than that of a film, so I am all for it. I feel that they also did a much better job in most of the other games of balancing the storytelling with these additional characters, but in this first movie tie-in, it feels a little bit unbalanced to me and a little bit out of whack. Tobey Maguire does a great job, Willem Dafoe does a great job, a lot of the actors from the film came in to voice their roles in the game, and of course they do a great job. The other villain voice actors do great work here as well. It was really fun to see Vulture, Shocker, Scorpion, Kraven, but in terms of characterization there just isn't much there, and also in terms of gameplay, it is a pretty standard brawler with a Spider-Man skin. Even the web swinging isn't particularly engaging. Rather than getting to connect to each individual web line as a player, you press the web swing button and it automatically starts web swinging you. All you can really do is steer and control the acceleration. If you go faster, it's harder to swing. So they did try to add some engaging mechanics to it, but it feels a little bit flat. And when you're swinging around as Spider-Man, that should be an exhilarating experience, not something that is about as monotonous as walking. With that being said, nothing like the web swinging of Spider-Man 2 had ever been seen before Spider-Man 2, so to look at Spider-Man 1 and try to hold it to that standard is completely unfair. they were doing their best for the time, they were doing their best for the technology that they had with them, and to be honest, it's a serviceable game. I have a lot of nostalgia for this one as well. I think it's fun, it has some cool level design, and some intriguing boss battles. Another thing that it misses though is the open world. Again, something that I'm not going to hold against it because it's not something that we'd ever seen in a Spider-Man game before, and that first mission in the game, Search for Justice, actually does flirt a lot with the idea of an open world. It doesn't give you Manhattan to explore, but it gives you a pretty big section of New York's rooftops to swing around. It even includes a basic side mission in which you help a woman find her purse, which was stolen from her on another rooftop. Again, it's very basic, but it is that first step toward crafting an open world New York City, which they clearly went all in on in the sequel. That first game does expand upon a few plot points. For example, chasing Uncle Ben's killer is a much longer process in that game, but I don't feel that it is noteworthy enough to really comment too much on, other than the fact that they do it. There isn't anything mind-blowing about it. And so while I really do find enjoyment in that first movie tie-in game as well, I don't feel that there's much to talk about, and I think that that's a perfect place to start this conversation about Spider-Man 2. I think that Spider-Man games were in that exact position. They very much were standard brawlers with a Spider-Man costume, and that's all well and good, but Spider-Man 2 was the game that turned everyone's head and really set Spider-Man apart from every other game out there. And so without any further ado, let's hop into the main event of this video. Let's get into Spider-Man 2, the video game. So my first real impression when I reopened this game for the first time in many years is that the graphics of this game have not aged very well, but that is to be expected. As I mentioned with some of the technical limitations in Spider-Man 1, I think Spider-Man 2 faced a similar issue where yes, they were able to have a huge open world map. They were able to essentially recreate Manhattan, though it's not a one-to-one recreation. It is a pretty accurate depiction of the city. They were able to create a fully explorable open world Manhattan for you to explore, and so it's understandable that the textures and the models aren't all going to look perfect. The layout of the city is actually pretty impressive, though the buildings themselves and the textures used are pretty limited, and it all feels pretty samey. If you're on one side of the map, it feels pretty similar to being on the other side of the map as well. There's not a lot of distinction besides a handful of landmarks. However, the fact that there is an open world game from 2004 where you get to swing around the city as Spider-Man is honestly really technologically impressive. Even looking at the next big superhero tie-in game, Batman Begins, which released the following year, the graphics have actually aged better in that game in my opinion. However, there is no open world. In fact, there is no exploration to speak of. The game is painfully linear, and that was the trade-off they made for that game. It seems stealth and graphics were the priority of that game, and the stealth is very scripted, the graphics look good, but it's very linear. Spider-Man did the opposite. There is no stealth in the game, and the graphics have not aged particularly well, but once you start swinging, all of that melts away. As you're swinging through the city, it doesn't really matter that it doesn't look great because the mechanics are actually designed quite well. The traversal of Spider-Man 2 was revolutionary for the time. The idea of pressing the web swing button, having Spider-Man shoot out a web that literally attaches to a physical object in the world, in most cases a building, but other objects such as helicopters can be grappled onto, having the swinging itself be physics-based, allowing the player to build up momentum depending on when they let go of the web was really ingenious. This is the first time it had ever been done, and it is a mechanic that has been used in almost every Spider-Man game since then. Despite the fact that Spider-Man 2 and some of its immediate sequels such as Spider-Man 3 and Ultimate Spider-Man lack a lot of the refined features of Insomniac's web swinging, in some ways I prefer the web swinging of these older games just because there's a larger learning curve to it, and there's more player agency. If you want to be able to launch from a jump into a swing, to running on a wall, to swinging on a flagpole, to jumping off into another swing, you have to get really good. You have to get good at timing when you let go of your webs. You have to get familiar with the layout of the city, and there are higher stakes with the web swinging in these games as well. There is fall damage, so if you get to a point where there are no buildings and you try to shoot out a web, there's nothing to attach to and you will face plant on the concrete and die. You also might have a timed objective that you're swinging toward, and if you don't know the layout of the city well enough, you might slam into the side of a wall, lose all of your momentum, and lose the challenge. Ultimately, the traversal of Spider-Man 2 allows you to pull off pretty much as many awesome tricks as you can in the Insomniac games, but it's all up to the player to pull them off. The game doesn't automatically do them for you, which I personally really enjoyed, and I hope that we see a bit of a return to that in the future Insomniac games. All the other traversal mechanics of Spider-Man 2 range from good to great. The wall crawling feels fast, the wall jumping feels really fun. The charge jump is a feature that I have always loved, and I am so glad that they implemented it in Spider-Man PS4. The only real nitpick that I can find about the traversal of Spider-Man 2 is sometimes the camera is a little bit hard to control while you are also swinging. Sometimes it feels like it's getting kind of stuck in a direction that you don't want it to be pointing, which can make it a little bit confusing when you're trying to determine where you are swinging to next. But when all is said and done, it's a really impressive system. All the traversal of Spider-Man 2 is clearly very well thought out, and it all works very well. Though improvements have been made to traversal in newer Spider-Man games, I wouldn't say that this system feels outdated or clunky. It just feels like something that has been improved upon. So now let's look at the open world activities, because great, we have an open world New York City that we can swing around and explore, but the thrill of traversal can really only last for so long. There needs to be more to the gameplay loop. So what can you do? To be honest, there's actually a pretty decent variety. You can save people who are injured, take them to the hospital, you can save construction workers from falling off of buildings, you can stop muggings, you can stop robberies. There are a lot of crimes that you can go and break up. The way that you activate these crimes is sometimes they just pop up with a purple waypoint on your map. Other times you get green question marks hovering over citizens' heads, indicating that you can talk to them and they will point out a crime or an emergency to you. There are also a handful of side missions which basically serve as traversal time challenges. For example, you can actually deliver pizzas as Spider-Man. It's a blast, it's super fun. You can also do some freelance work for the Daily Bugle. You can go get an assignment from Robbie and you get a time challenge to go and take all the photos that you need, get them back to the Daily Bugle in time. There's also a warehouse that you can unlock later in the game where there are some challenge maps. You can go and fight your way through waves of enemies, you can experiment with combos, practice using your upgrades, and it is a good way to get better at the combat system. So ultimately, in terms of busy work, this city does have some good side missions to it. There are things to do in New York City, and it keeps you pretty engaged throughout the duration of the campaign. I will say that the variety starts to wear thin by the end of the campaign. You start to see the repetition, and you do start to get a little bit bored. It's a shame that there aren't more side missions that involve supervillains. That was something that I think was also noticed in Batman Arkham Asylum, which released in 2009. I think that players and developers started realizing we have this really impressive map for the player to explore, but once the campaign and collectibles have been finished, there's not really anything else to do. There's not really any endgame content. And I think that that is what really inspired games like Arkham City and Spider-Man PS4 to have really immersive open worlds with other supervillains who aren't in the main campaign also running amok kind of independently. Like I said, Spider-Man 2 doesn't really have that. I think it does have one secret boss fight that you can find, but that's about it. It is interesting because this game also has a lot on the cutting room floor. If you look it up, a lot of the missions from Spider-Man 3, the game, were actually intended to be in Spider-Man 2. From what I understand, a lot of the map had to be cut just due to time restrictions, but they fully intended there to be sewers and subways completely explorable in this game. There were a lot of other villains they wanted to have show up in this game, but just ran out of time. And it does sometimes make me wonder what could have happened if Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3 were merged. What if Activision had just been given full freedom to create a Spider-Man game and release it whenever they want? Obviously that's not what happened, but that is something that's interesting to think about, and it's something that we'll talk about more in my Spider-Man 3 video essay. But getting back to Spider-Man 2, let's talk about the combat here, because the combat, I will say, is not as impressive to me. It is very bare bones. It essentially feels like the free flow combat system of the Arkham games, but dumbed down and not as refined. The combat in this game can get a little bit frustrating as thugs can block Spider-Man's attacks, and sometimes they can block almost all of his attacks. It doesn't feel complicated or difficult as much as just frustrating. I'd also argue that there's not really any evolution to the combat throughout the game. Once you've learned it, you know it. It's not really like the web swinging in the sense that you really get to learn a lot of cool new things to do. There are a handful of cool tricks, like for example, you can hang thugs from lampposts with your webs, that's fun, and there are things to experiment. The combos are interesting, but there's nothing to really challenge the player. Nothing needs to be learned. None of these combos need to be used. They're kind of just fun things that the player can use to add flavor to their fighting style, but there isn't really any evolution to the difficulty or the challenge of the combat. I'd argue actually that the combat is the slowest and clunkiest part of the gameplay loop, and it's still serviceable. It's not bad, it's just okay. This is the only thing so far outside of the graphics that I will say really hasn't aged all that well. To be fair, again, this came at a time when we didn't have the free flow combat of the Arkham games, but in terms of looking at this as a definitive Spider-Man experience, I don't feel that the combat really hit the mark outside of maybe a few boss battles. Some of the boss battles with Dr. Octavius in particular feel pretty tense and difficult, and I do appreciate those, and maybe that's where you can really focus on improving as a crime fighter and improving your fighting style is in those boss battles, getting really proficient at finding the villain's weaknesses. But overall, it just is perhaps the weakest element of this game. Finally, let's talk about what I think a lot of you are here to listen to me talk about, and that is the story. So if you were chapter jumping and this is the first thing that you're hearing from the video, welcome to my Spider-Man 2 analysis. Let's talk about the story. The thing that I think that Activision did so well with this game is that it starts at the same point that the film begins, and it reaches the destination that the film reaches at the end, but the journey getting there is very different. The game, like the film, opens with Peter Parker being late to everything and having a really hard time managing his time and his life and the balance between being Peter Parker and being Spider-Man. You're constantly receiving objectives and waypoints saying, oh, you're late to go visit Dr. Connors. You're on the way, a crime breaks out, you have to go stop it. By the time you get to Dr. Connor's class, you're late, you've missed it, and he tells you that he's gonna fail you unless you can start showing up. You realize that you're late to your own birthday party being thrown by Mary Jane and Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn is clearly upset that you're taking pictures of Spider-Man, who he believes killed his father, and throughout the opening hours of this game, you also recognize that Mary Jane is upset that Peter Parker isn't showing up. He constantly misses her play, and this is all included in the gameplay. You'll be on the way to her place, some big crime will pop up that you have to go stop. So it's all very clever, and it really does help you start empathizing with Peter. And the way that it does that is it does a really good job of making the Spider-Man gameplay fun, but it also shows how it is a burden on Peter, because you don't want to disappoint your friends as the player in this game. You want to make it to Mary Jane's play, and every time that notification of a crime popping up while you're on the way to her play happens, part of you kind of wants to just go to the play anyway. You obviously can't, it's scripted, but there is that part of you that thinks, what if I could just go do that and get the happy cutscene where she's happy that I made it? The game does a really good job of slowly building the stakes and the tension. Like I mentioned, the game really does open with you as Spider-Man being like, oh crap, I'm late to go visit MJ. Oh crap, I'm late to class. Oh crap, I'm late to deliver pizzas. But the threats of New York City start to really become more and more deadly. For example, pretty early on in the game, you have to go up against Rhino. It's a pretty easy boss fight, but it does start to show that New York is becoming more dangerous, not less, and the things on Peter's plate are growing, not shrinking. In fact, the number of jobs and activities that Peter and Spider-Man are both involved in this game do really paint a picture of how busy this guy is and how unmanageable his life has become. You really can understand why he's late to everything, because he's stretched way too thin both as Peter and as Spider-Man. And I think that the first true success of this game's story is it really paints a picture of never making the Spider-Man gameplay unfun or the Spider-Man persona unfun, but again showing that it's a burden to Peter, and also on the other hand showing that the Peter persona is a burden in many ways to Spider-Man. So the first big culmination of this story is when you're trying to get to Mary Jane's play. She's giving you tickets for the play, telling you to please actually show up to this one, and she mentions that she is seeing someone. I think that this is another change from the film that was done very well in the game. In the film, when MJ starts dating J. Jonah Jameson's son and agrees to marry him, it almost feels like it's done to spite Peter, which works for the context of the film, it works for that script. In the game, there isn't really enough build-up for it to be that emotionally charged, and so instead it feels a lot more like a passive decision on MJ's part. It feels like an intentional choice that she's realizing that even though she's interested in Peter, he clearly must not feel the same way because he's not making time for her. It feels like a genuine, natural progression for their relationship, or lack thereof of a relationship, to move forward. It doesn't feel like some random out-of-character beat for the game, since we didn't see some of those films' plot points in the game. Instead, they found what worked for the game's story and went in that direction instead, and I really admire them for that. It is no sooner after MJ mentions to Peter that she is seeing someone that we get our first introduction to Black Cat. Now, initially we don't know what to make of her. We don't know if she's just a cat burglar or if she has an ulterior motive for good, but whatever the reason that she is in this museum, Spider-Man chases her across the rooftops. He is interested in learning more about this person, and it's pretty clear pretty quickly that he is developing an infatuation for her. And this is where the story of the game really starts to deviate from that of the film. In the film, you'll remember he actually starts losing his power. It's a film where he gives up being Spider-Man because the balance just isn't there. He is living two lives and they are too complicated, and so he decides to be Peter Parker as he is losing his powers as Spider-Man. And I feel like this game takes the opposite approach. This game tells a story about what happens when Peter Parker gives up Peter Parker to become Spider-Man full-time. And Black Cat actually plays a major role in that. She plays an external analogy for what is happening within Peter. And this is where we really start to see the characterization and character arc of Peter Parker in this game. And I think that this is the true genius of Spider-Man 2 and why people relate to it so much, is that it's a game about the balance of Spider-Man and Peter Parker, and it shows how Peter views the mantle of Spider-Man. It is a gift, but it is also a curse. It is really fun to swing around the city, it is really rewarding to take criminals to justice, and it is really satisfying to save citizens. But when Spider-Man is out doing his thing, Peter Parker suffers. His life gets put on hold, and as a result, it moves on without him. And the same is true of Spider-Man. But the problem is that putting Spider-Man's life on hold can result in people's deaths. Spider-Man 2, the game, shows this conflict so well. It shows Spider-Man's role and the required responsibility that Peter must have, and the level of respect and dedication that he must carry to his superheroed alter ego, but also the conflict that it puts him in as Peter Parker. Now, this is about the point of the story that we start getting introduced to Quentin Beck, and initially I didn't really understand this character's role in the story. It feels like a branch that doesn't really connect back to anything else, and even if that's all it was, if it was just a side villain to break up the pacing, I would be fine with that, but I think that there actually is a little bit more to it than that. I think that Quentin Beck, who later becomes Mysterio in the story, is a good example of how New York sees Spider-Man. We get to see some of the most interactions between Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson in this subplot, and as a result, we also get to see how J. Jonah Jameson is choosing to showcase the wall crawler, and we get to see how citizens actually react to that as well. So Mysterio is a fun character to go up against. He has some really cool set pieces, which aren't necessarily super connected to that main story, but I think that the subplot itself does carry some weight in terms of how the city is viewing Spider-Man. In their first encounter, Quentin Beck claims as a VFX artist that he knows how Spider-Man is faking his powers. He doesn't think Spider-Man is legitimate. He doesn't think that he is actually a superhero, and Spider-Man absolutely makes a laughingstock of this guy. It kind of shows that New York City sees Spider-Man as a protector of New York and a true hero. But in their second encounter, Spider-Man seems completely unmatched. The set piece is Mysterio taking over the Statue of Liberty, and Spider-Man seems very ineffective, arguably even irresponsible in taking down the threat the second time. It starts to show how perhaps the citizens of New York think that he is allowing the power of these enemies to slip out of his hands, and they are starting to grow more powerful even than him. Later, after visiting the Daily Bugle, where J. Jonah Jameson talks about how he is running hit pieces on Spider-Man, Spider-Man jumps down to help a citizen in distress, and they do not want his help. They believe he is a full-on criminal. So we start to see J. Jonah Jameson, and by extension, the city's turn against Spider-Man in this subplot. The game also has some good build-up to Dr. Otto Octavius turning into Doc Ock later in the story. Peter goes and visits him every now and then, and they talk about the science experiment, and the game balances all of these subplots really well. It has some really good build-up toward the villains that don't start out completely as supervillains in their final form, but build toward them. There's a lot of great foreshadowing, there's a lot of great early encounters, and many of them actually feel very fleshed out. Quentin Beck gets a full arc in this game, and it feels very fleshed out and really compelling. Same with Dr. Octavius, and they borrow a lot from the film, but it works in its own right in the game as well. So as this story continues, MJ announces that she's now going to marry J. Jonah Jameson, and this puts Spider-Man in even more emotional distress, and it does start to make the player ask the question, why does he even need to be Peter Parker anymore? Harry Osborn's mad at him, MJ is moving on. It seems almost logical to be Spider-Man at this point, and that's right when Black Cat steps in and would agree with us, the player, and starts to tell Spider-Man that he should essentially leave behind his secret identity and just go out, have fun, and be a superhero. She almost has the mentality that Zack Snyder has towards superheroes, which is that they are kind of gods in their own right, like the way that we view Zeus in Greek mythology, and she kind of argues that Spider-Man should just do what she does, where she goes, she does whatever she wants, and she really is setting him on a path of self-indulgence. It seems that she's potentially trying to lay the groundwork to get him to assist in robberies at some point, and start to get him to act on self-serving urges. Now, I know I'm sounding like a broken record when I say another great thing the game does, but another great thing the game does is it makes these Black Cat missions where you're teaming up with her some of the most fun in the game. As I mentioned, a lot of the Spider-Man missions leading up to this, while fun, showed a very real conflict of interest with Peter Parker's personal life. It showed them as a burden, and the Black Cat missions simply don't. Anytime you go team up with Black Cat, there's really nothing else that Peter has to worry about. Now, every now and then there are consequences after the fact. For example, there is a mission where you go with her to fight Shocker, and then remember after, oh, I was supposed to go to MJ's play and I missed it. But during the missions themselves, there's never anything else going on. You're able to give your undivided attention to Black Cat. And this really starts to play on an aspect of storytelling, which is the main character's wants versus the main character's needs. And in this game, Peter starts neglecting Peter Parker's needs because of his wants as Spider-Man. They do a good job of building Peter's infatuation toward Black Cat, and they do a pretty good job of getting the player infatuated with the character as well, which is pretty rare for games to pull off successfully, but this is one of the ones that does it. Going and playing laser tag might be a really fun activity on its own, but going and playing laser tag with your crush is a whole different experience, and Spider-Man 2 certainly has you playing laser tag with Spider-Man's crush. As I mentioned, these are some of the most fun missions in the game. The boss battles against Shocker, where you get to team up with Black Cat, are really fun and a cool change of pace from some of the more monotonous crimes that you've had to face earlier in the story. They're more exciting. Exploring the city with her, getting the drop on criminals, and teaming up with her to take them down. It's quite fun. The gameplay loop at this point, I think, is the best balanced and the most varied. This is where we really get to see the genius of Spider-Man 2's story in the game, which is that as a player, we feel many of the same emotions that Peter is feeling. It is putting us in his shoes, and if you played this game when you were young, and maybe even if you play it when you're older, there's a good chance that there will come a point where you forget that you are playing a game and you will just feel like you are Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And in my opinion, that is the ultimate compliment that I can give this game. It really does put you in Peter's shoes, and it does a great job of making you empathize with him. The first hint of trouble comes at the end of the first Shocker boss fight, where Black Cat is mildly injured by him. Her pride is clearly hurt, she runs off, but then later comes back and you take on Shocker again. But it's a moment that does have a very foreshadowing feeling to it, and it definitely pays off very soon after. It occurs when she takes you on another mission where you're gonna get the drop on some thugs. But rather than sneaking in as planned and getting the drop on a few thugs, she jumps into the middle of a firefight, and this firefight is far and away the hardest mission of the game. This is the first time that you are going to participate in a Black Cat mission and think, wow, this really is not fun. And Peter Parker feels the same way in the canon of the game. He chews her out, says that that was way too reckless, way too dangerous. Black Cat clearly doesn't see an issue with it, doesn't see why Peter is acting so uptight about it, and we as the player start to see where the problem is. Peter Parker is already putting his life on the line as Spider-Man, but he has people to live for. He monologues about this after this mission. He talks about how there is Aunt May, how Harry and MJ, despite the fact that they aren't very happy with him right now, still do need him. Peter Parker is still needed, and he can't just give that up. And it's not necessarily explicitly stated in this game, but it is heavily implied that Peter recognizes the danger that he is going into every time he puts on the mask, and he doesn't need to add additional risks. He doesn't need to go make very reckless decisions, and so he does the smart, logical, responsible thing. He breaks up with Black Cat, and I think that this game is very mature in how it handles this breakup. Black Cat doesn't freak out and go into a frenzy about it. It doesn't turn into some boss fight. She understandingly sends him off on his way. They both sort of thank each other for the experience that they had, acknowledge that it was fun and that they enjoyed it, but that they are two different people and neither one of them is willing to give up who they are to be with the other person. Peter realizes that as hard as it is, he does need to find the balance between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He needs to take care of Peter Parker's needs, but also responsibly use his abilities for good as Spider-Man. After making his decision to end things with Black Cat, Peter goes back to MJ and fully committed tells her that he wants to be with her. He knows that she's getting married, but he wants to be with her. And her decision to be with J. Jonah Jameson's son does not stop him from wanting to be with her, and he goes and he's honest with her. It's another really beautiful moment. It's one that's reminiscent of the film as well, but it's also handled well in the game and well earned. It shows Peter's recommitment to what he wanted at the beginning of the game. It shows that the temptation to just give it all up because it would have been easier didn't take, and he decided to make the choice that was hard, but also the choice that was right for him. Mary Jane is of course initially hesitant at this prospect because she's engaged to be married, but realizing that she truly does have feelings for Peter tells him to meet her. She's starting to seem open to being with Peter again, and then, like in the film, she is kidnapped by Doc Ock. Now, this is where we get back on the same track as the film, essentially. It becomes a very close movie adaptation once again, and it really does bookend the original parts of this story very well. It showed Peter's lack of balance and his decision to find the balance, and now Doc Ock is that final dragon for him to slay before he can have the life and the woman that he wants. Doc Ock is a very formidable foe, but you've learned a lot about the combat system and you are ready to take him on. There are a handful of really hard encounters, one where you have to go and explore his lair and find like 9 terminals that you have to disable while he is chasing you, and plasma blasts are killing you, but ultimately you get through it and the game ends. And as I mentioned, there isn't tons to keep you invested after the main campaign. You can continue to explore the city if you would like to. There are things to do, but there's a good chance that you'd be more willing to start the game from scratch as opposed to just explore the city with not tons left to do with the same level of quality or stakes as that main campaign. But it also might be a time to just relax and enjoy some of the traversal mechanics and some of the combat. So while the longevity after that main campaign has been completed is very minimal, the campaign itself, the story, and the mechanics that go with it are a package that really do demonstrate the duality of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. I do think that this is a timeless story that serves the lore and the character very well, and I am pleased to say that this game is even better than I remember it being. I really do appreciate the player agency when you're web swinging. I really enjoy the story that it had to tell. While in my opinion, the quality of storytelling in this game isn't as good as Insomniac has shown us lately, I do think that it is better paced than Spider-Man PS4. And that's saying a lot because I was very excited and intrigued by Spider-Man PS4. This game just strikes a nice balance with its gameplay loop. It always has something interesting happening, and it never lingers too long on a specific point of gameplay or story beats. And it just has a nice range of dynamic pieces of Spider-Man's gameplay and lore, and it's all tied together in a really nice bow. It contains enough Spider-Man lore to feel lived in and interesting, but not so much that it feels bloated or stretched too thin. I'm a huge fan of Spider-Man 2. If you've never played it, I highly recommend that you check it out. If you haven't played it for years, I would recommend that you'd maybe go revisit it. Even without nostalgia, Spider-Man 2 is an amazing Spider-Man game. I'm super thankful to all the devs who worked on this game. Just know if you're a dev who worked on Spider-Man 2, you added a really bright spot to my childhood, and I am really grateful to you for that. Well, there you have it. I'm going to talk about Spider-Man 3 next. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let me know in the comments below what you think about Spider-Man 2, the game. Thanks again so much for watching. Your support means the world to me. We will see you guys in the next one.